We've got the mountains sort of looming over in the distance and a very low fog today.
Typical Belfast weather.
I'm driving through Belfast with tour guide Trevor on one of those Troubles history tours that take place in retired black taxis.
North Belfast, right across the whole area here, is all segregated communities. A lot of people still feel more secure in an area of their co-religionists.
Northern Ireland remains divided. Whole sections of cities and towns here are either Protestant or Catholic. Over 90% of children here go to segregated schools, and tensions can still flare up.
There are areas of the city which are integrated, where the people do live together quite peacefully. Up in this part of the city here, it's not like that.
This is where the Troubles began, back in 1969. On the fault line between the Shankill Road, home of the UDA and Brian Nelson, and the Falls Road, home of the IRA and Freddie Scappaticci.
There are 5 connecting roads between the Shankill and the Falls nowadays, 5 sets of gates.
These gates separate the Shankill Road from the Falls Road. They're locked every night when the sun goes down.
And reopened in the following morning. These areas which have seen a lot of conflict, death and destruction over the years, they still feel that need to have the gates in place and to have the peace wall there.
The peace walls divide areas that were at war with one another for 30 years. There are more than 60 of them in Northern Ireland, and they run for over 20 miles. The majority are here in Belfast.
This is the main peace wall just coming into view here. I think there's roughly about 40 different barriers throughout the city. This one here is approximately about 1.5 miles.
Some 70% of people killed during the Troubles are thought to have died within 500 metres of one of these walls.
So the wall stretches from Weaken through the gates there, right up into the distance, right up beyond there.
The wall's really high, it's taller than a house.
Roughly 50 foot in height.
That's 3 times as high as the Berlin Wall, and it's been in place for almost twice as long. The peace walls were first built by the British Army as temporary barriers made from corrugated iron, but over the years they became permanent.
Solid concrete blocks. It wasn't high enough, so they had to put the corrugated sheeting on. It still wasn't high enough, and then they had to put the top tier on.
I think people that have never been to Belfast will be surprised to know that this still exists, that it's still so divided.
Even people from the south of Ireland come to visit here, and they're surprised to see this still in place.
Shall we get out and have a little look at the wall?
You can see there's a lot of slogans on the wall here.
They're covered in bright graffiti.
What's this one say? There's always more to unite than divide. And someone here, let there be peace.
The walls were meant to come down 25 years after the Good Friday Agreement. But in 2023, the anniversary came and went, and the peace walls remained. Do you think they'll ever come down?
Not in my lifetime. There's no desire from either community to have it taken down, or the gates left open at night either. Sometimes the peace process can be pretty fragile. Doesn't take very much for it to kick violence off.
Nearly 30 years have passed since the Troubles ended, almost as long as the conflict itself. And yet the past feels keenly present, because so much has been left unresolved. More than 50,000 people were killed, widowed, and seriously injured, and 1,000 deaths are still unsolved. As I come to the end of my reporting, I keep thinking about something Pat Finucane's widow, Geraldine, said to me. That Northern Ireland will never heal until the wounds are thoroughly cleaned. That they'll fester away until eventually something will happen that isn't very pleasant. Old enemies live a few doors down from one another. Former gunmen shop in the same supermarkets as the families of people they killed. And thousands of people are still fighting for justice. I'm Cara McGugan, and this is Bed of Lies, Episode 9, Legacy. Brendan Duffy and his partner Jamie Smith were bonded by the tragedy of the mobile shop murders, when loyalist gunman Alan Oliver killed 3 people, including Brendan's teenage sister Eileen, and attacked Jamie. In 2019, the couple were at a supermarket when all that history came crashing back.
We actually run into Alan Oliver, who's the man we suspect of carrying out the shooting at the mobile shop.
The man a court had held liable for killing Eileen Duffy, Katrina Rennie and Brian Frizzell, who Brendan believes was an agent because he never faced charges.
And he was in a Asda store in Portadown where we had went to do our shopping.
Alan Oliver was collecting money. Brendan nudged Jamie.
Look, I think that's Alan Oliver at the door. Don't be panicking. So I'd sort of ushered her out and past him.
Jamie was at the mobile shop with Eileen when she was murdered. Alan Oliver had attacked her too. She pulled away from Brendan and went to confront him.
And she said to him, "What do you think you're doing? You're nothing but a murdering bastard." He just stood there gormless, couldn't look at her in the eye. I don't think he realises that maybe 29 years prior, this was the 14-year-old girl that he dragged by the hair and shot her 2 friends. For weeks after, she had this feeling that he was coming back for her again.
Brendan isn't the only person I've spoken with who's come face to face with Alan Oliver. He was involved in at least 14 killings. Hugo Lynch lost his brother Jervis when he was shot dead on their family farm by the same Mid-Ulster UVF gang back in 1991. A couple of years ago, Hugo went to Alan Oliver's work.
Time I'd went to see Alan Oliver in an office, and I'd actually pushed like a hammer down with like some trousers.
Alan wasn't there, but Hugo couldn't stop thinking about him. He had so many questions about Jervis's death. So on the anniversary in January 2023, he tried again.
So I went down to that yard, and the front gates were opened. I just drove in.
Alan came out of his office and walked towards Hugo.
Face to face, only a metre from him or 2. He just says, "Tell me this, Alan, does this day mean anything to you?" And he says, "What do you mean?" I says, "What about 32 years tonight?" I said, "What did that young boy say to you when you pointed that gun? Did he shout 'Mommy' or 'Don't shoot' or 'Help'?"
In a soft voice, Alan denied being there that night and said,
"You have to remember all them 30 odd years ago. We were seeing all the Roman Catholics, that's what he called them, Roman Catholics, voting for Sinn Féin, half the Roman Catholics in the 6 counties. And he says to us that meant every second Catholic supported the IRA. And says we had to sort of fight back and do something about it." And then he started quoting all these biblical quotes and all about God. He calls himself a pastor or a minister. God, you wouldn't think he had this past about him. Like.
Hugo became panicky and started to shake.
It was hard to meet somebody who had ruined your whole life, the whole family. Like.
Alan went to get Hugo a bottle of water to help calm him down. He brought back a booklet with him. It looked like a passport and said "Eternal Kingdom of Heaven" on the front. As their conversation drew to a close, Alan caught Hugo off guard.
"I've never told anybody this before." He put his hand out and he says to me, "Can I shake your hand?" And I was shaking. I don't even know why I should have done that or not, and it was very hard to do. That was the hardest thing.
Do you feel now you've spoken to him, has that closed something for you?
I don't know if it did close things or just open more things up. It's hard to say, like, you know. It wasn't closure anyway, you know, but I don't even... Might even made you worse.
Alan gave Hugo his number and said,
"If ever you want to ring me or something, I'll be me and God will be there for yourself," and some words to that effect.
Hugo never called, but I give the number a try. There's so much I want to ask him on behalf of the families.
Hello?
Hi, is that Alan Oliver?
Speaking, yeah.
Hi, my name's Cara. I'm a journalist. I'm making a podcast. A contact gave me your number. I'm researching some of the murders that you were involved in and whether you were an agent.
I have absolutely known the city, and you are making some reasons there that make no sense. Cheerio.
Well, you've been found... Alan Oliver might not be willing to speak to me, but I found out a bit more about what he does now. He's a pastor for one of the biggest evangelical churches in the UK, the Elim Pentecostal Church. They're Protestant. A few years ago, he shared his story in a video for the church.
Hello, my name is Alan Oliver. I'm 42 years of age and I have been born and bred in Portadown, lived there all my life. You know, I was filled with hatred and Jesus brought love. I was filled with fear and he brought comfort. I was a perpetrator, but I was also a prisoner to the conflict in this country, to the hurts and the pains. My employment was to bring destruction, to public disorder, stone throwing, heavily involved in organised crime and political violence. One of my qualifications is that I've made every mistake that any of those kids will ever make. I've made every single mistake they can ever make.
Alan Oliver's not the only person walking free while his victims' families wait for answers. There's also former army agent Peter Keeley, who wrote Unsung Hero about his time spying on the IRA. He now works in private security. He's been to Ukraine to teach people how to make improvised explosive devices, and he's conducted intelligence work for Tommy Robinson on paedophile rings. I haven't been able to get in touch with Peter Keeley, but he did give an interview to American right-wing commentator Alex Jones on Infowars back in 2006.
Thank you for coming on the show with us.
Hi Alex, thank you very much for having me on the show. Listen, the best way to put it to your listeners is, I was a soldier recruited to go into the IRA. Basically, in my capacity as a British agent, I became a terrorist. Now, you can't pretend to be a terrorist. You know, I had to be able to do the same thing as the man next to me was doing. I'm not going to go into specifics, but just listen to what I'm saying. You know, that's exactly what it is.
How do you feel now about society in this area, like living alongside one another, potentially bumping into each other at the supermarket? Do you feel like you can the society can kind of come back together and move forward?
It is still divided, but to me, them people are nothing to me. They're nobodies. All we want is just to admit there was collusion.
On one of my many reporting trips to Belfast in the last couple of years, I found a perfect example of how establishing the truth after disasters can help heal wounds. From this corner of the museum, you can see out over the dry docks where the Titanic and its sister ship were actually built. The Titanic Museum is one of Belfast's greatest tourist attractions. It's in the spot where the cruise liner was built. There's a new exhibit towards the end of the museum, which I'm interested in. This is quite an atmospheric, dark room. There's big, glowing letters, "Never Again." So in the days and weeks after the Titanic sunk, 2 inquiries began in New York and Britain. And this wall is pasted with pages and pages of witness testimonies from those inquiries. People that knew what had happened, why, where mistakes had been made. The disaster led to important improvements in global maritime safety, standards that still exist today. And for that reason, there hasn't been anything on the scale of the Titanic disaster since it sank in 1912. Unlike with the Titanic, there's been no sweeping inquiry into wrongdoing in the Troubles by the IRA, loyalists, or the state. Investigations have unearthed shocking levels of collusion and exposed key figures, like the reports from Lord Stevens, Sir Desmond de Silva, and Justice Peter Corey. But none of these have given us the full picture or dealt with the legacy of so much trauma.
I think sort of piecemeal approaches to pick out, X or Y or this murder or that murder, I don't think it helps.
Sir Hugh Ord was Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland from 2002 until 2009.
Got to sit here.
Why?
Because that's your seat.
He arrives at the Telegraph's office wearing a yellow beanie, and he's excited to see his old colleague Phil James.
Mr. James, how are you, sir?
I'm top form, boss. How are you?
You don't look as if you age at all, which is very irritating.
Who I've been interviewing with reporter John Ware.
I wouldn't say you look too bad yourself.
Getting old.
By Hugh's time, the police service had been reformed from the RUC to shake off the damaging reputation that resulted from collusion. Hugh had his own changes to make, having previously been an investigator on the third Stevens inquiry.
One of the first things I did as Chief Constable was conduct a full review of every single informant we owned, and we then disowned 40% of them. Looking at some of the loyalist gangs, I was running them. I had so many informants in them.
Hugh wanted to address the mounting questions people had about the past.
I sort of got to understand that we had to do something, and that something had to be very special and very different. If you take a forensic police investigation approach, which is what we did obviously under Stevens 3, you invest 6-7 million in solving one case. There's 3,000, and that's just for the people who died.
He set up the Historical Inquiries Team, or HET, a police unit with 100 investigators who would re-examine more than 3,200 unsolved murders from the Troubles. They would review the evidence for each murder and write reports for the families. The plan was to deal with every case in 6 years, going chronologically from 1969 to 1998.
It was more about trying to give people some resolution to their unanswered questions. I sat in on many of the interviews with the families, and we actually took a novel approach of asking them what they wanted before we started their case. And in many cases, they didn't want to know who did it. They probably knew. They wanted to know about their loved one who had died, how they'd died, who was with them, all sorts of really human things they'd been denied.
Hugh asked former colleagues from the Stevens inquiry to come on board, including Phil James.
I really fancied that challenge, so I said yes, I would. Massive task, crazy. But without Hugh being the Chief Constable, it would never fly because it was so different.
They found countless examples of collusion between the paramilitaries and security forces.
We solved a few cases.
As the detectives were hard at work, a landmark report was underway to try and address the overall legacy of the Troubles. Published in 2009, the Ames-Bradley report was nearly 200 pages long, and it contained more than 30 recommendations. They included the creation of a £100 million fund for projects to tackle division, a plan to bring down the peace walls, and the establishment of a legacy commission that would try to give families answers and recover missing information. The plan was for the Historical Inquiries Team to become its investigations unit. Phil James again.
Which was so sensible, so sensible. I personally thought that they had it pretty well spot on.
But one recommendation in the report brought the whole thing down. A £12,000 payment for every family who'd lost someone in the Troubles, in recognition of their pain. There was outcry that families of paramilitary members would receive the money.
One of the arguments was it was too expensive. Well, we have spent millions on individual cases.
The Ames-Bradley report was never implemented. If it had been, Northern Ireland could now be a very different place.
It'd be over by now.
I agree. I think it would be over, and I think it would be far more in the public domain. The only things you should keep secret from the public are things that are in the public interest to keep secret, not the police or not the army or not anybody else.
5 years after Hugh Ord stepped down as Chief Constable, in 2014, the Historical Inquiries Team was closed down, long before it had completed its work. It was far more time-consuming and expensive than he could have anticipated.
I continually look back with a degree of anger on the fact the HET wasn't allowed to finish its work.
One case from the Historical Inquiries team does continue to this day: the investigation into the agent's Stakeknife. Operation Kenova has been running for 8 years. They made their first big arrests back in 2018. Dozens of police raided a house in Guildford that was home to a man known as Frank Conway. The man we know is Freddie Scappaticci. Officers dragged Scap's belongings onto the street and piled his computers, hard drives and more into their vans. Then they took Scap away. They found enough evidence to charge him with a surprising crime: extreme pornography involving animals. It's been said Scap watched porn with his father and also preyed on young girls. When the Kenova detectives arrested him for extreme porn, he told them he was depressed and not doing anyone any real harm. He received a suspended sentence. The magistrate said, "You have not been in court for 50 years. That's good character in my book." Scap's victims and their families had hoped Operation Kenova would finally bring him to book, but he never appeared in court again. In April 2023, the head of Operation Kenova, John Boucher, announced that Freddie Scappaticci had died. There would be no further charges brought against him for the 14 murders and 15 abductions he was involved in.
A man believed to have been the highest-ranking British Army agent within the IRA, who was linked to dozens of murders, has died. Freddie Scappaticci from West Belfast denied being the agent codenamed Stakeknife. He was a former head of the IRA's notorious internal security.
The day that Scappaticci died, I'm sure there were many people in Whitehall who felt so relieved that he had passed away.
That's former Frew handler Rob Lewis.
And they probably went down to the local wine bar and toasted his death.
A year later, John Boucher convened a press conference. He was ready to publish his interim report on the agent Stakeknife and those who worked with him, including the IRA, the Frew, and MI5. He said Stakeknife had definitively cost more lives than he'd saved.
Those responsible for murder were not brought to justice and were instead left free to re-offend again.
He had a damning indictment for the establishment that handled Stakeknife. A lack of regulation, oversight and leadership had put lives at risk.
And it fostered a maverick culture for some, where agent handling was sometimes seen as high-stakes, dark art and was practised off the books. As a result, murders that could and should have been prevented were allowed to take place, with the knowledge of the security forces.
At the end of his speech, John Boucher said,
"The United Kingdom government should apologise to the Kenova families for the failures of the security forces to protect the lives of their loved ones, investigate the crimes committed against them and treat them with the fairness, compassion, respect and transparency that they deserved."
But, he added, it's not just the government that needs to apologise.
It was the IRA's internal security unit that brutalised and murdered these victims that it accused, often wrongly, of being agents. The Republican leadership should accept its accountability for these heinous crimes.
A year has passed and neither the IRA nor the government have apologised. John Boucher hadn't held back, but there was one thing he wasn't able to say. He could neither confirm nor deny that Freddie Scappaticci was the agent Stakeknife. His written report has a section on Stakeknife and a section on Freddie Scappaticci, but he doesn't link the two. To this day, Operation Kenova is still fighting to be able to name Stakeknife. Their main opponent, MI5. Reporter John Ware says,
Scappaticci has become so notorious now that there is surely a powerful public interest argument for saying, yep, it's true, Scappaticci was the agent known as Stakeknife. Apart from anything else, he's dead. So where is the risk to national security? It deprives a whole bunch of families of the facts a generation or more after they lost their relatives in the most brutal way at the hands of the IRA with state involvement. And it's really pretty cruel to withhold that.
Operation Kenova has so far sent 28 files to the Public Prosecution Service in relation to Stakeknife and the people associated with him.
Those files covered 2 individuals from MI5, 12 military intelligence personnel and civilians, meaning members of the IRA. My understanding is that every prosecutorial file they submitted, except for one, there was what they regarded as, quote, a sufficiency of evidence for a prosecution.
And yet, once again, the prosecution service hasn't taken any cases forward. The whole team at Operation Kenova have been left feeling frustrated. And those frustrations were about to get even worse. John Ware has new information on exactly why. A few weeks after John Boucher delivered his interim report in 2024, he got a call from officers who were embedded at MI5's headquarters.
And they're telling him there's a whole bunch of files here which we didn't know existed and which the service had not disclosed to us before the interim report. And that, I think, really stunned him.
Not only was MI5 disclosing highly relevant files very late in the day, they were doing so just weeks before a new law came into force that banned further criminal investigations into matters from the Troubles.
And I guess you have to ask yourself, is this just a mistake? Is this just sort of a bit of curmudgeonly non-cooperation? Or is it deliberate?
It all sounds very similar to what we've heard previously with Corey and Stevens and De Silva.
A man from Mars would have to say there is a bit of a pattern here. And that pattern has continued from the mid-1980s right up to the present day. As one source put it, the files weren't found down the back of a sofa.
At first, it was just a few new files, but by the end of 2024, MI5 had turned up.
Literally hundreds of pages of evidence, of intelligence reports anyway, relating to Stakeknife.
Including copies of the Army's handling records for Stakeknife that were thought to have been destroyed, and documents from MI5, who said they'd discovered all this as part of a digitisation process. The files revealed MI5 had lied about their own role in the Stakeknife affair. They'd always insisted that they didn't know about Freddie Scappaticci until he needed to be resettled, that they'd never been involved in handling or tasking him, and they certainly didn't know about any criminality.
These files show that on each and every one of those points, that's not true.
And so MI5 were tasking Scappaticci when he was a spy?
They were tasking him operationally on occasions. I can imagine there would have been matters to do with the political direction of the Provisional IRA rather than day-to-day tactical stuff.
Had Operation Kenova received them in the beginning, they could have made all the difference.
Had those reports, those files been available to them, it might well have ended in prosecutions. So there's a lot of frustration about that.
Operation Kenova's final report has been pushed back while they assess this new information, and families have been left waiting even longer. To date, no one has ever been prosecuted for Stakeknife's crimes. The omerta around his time in the IRA continues, and not just in the intelligence services. In Republican communities, there's still a stigma associated with informers. So relatives bereaved by the nutting squad have mostly kept quiet. But in the final weeks of my reporting, someone whose dad was killed by Stakeknife comes forward. He's willing to speak to me. More on that after this short break.
Hi, I'm Louisa Wells, Head of Audio at The Telegraph and one of the exec producers on Bed of Lies. I wanted to quickly say thank you so much for listening to this series, and we hope you've enjoyed the episodes. Cara and the wider Bed of Lies team have spent years digging into this story, following the inner workings of multiple inquiries, sifting through documents to get to the truth, and piecing together difficult testimonies from victims, agents, and officials. And making a podcast like this one really does take that amount of time, and we couldn't do it without the Telegraph subscribers. If you'd like to support us making more series like this one, and to read as much as you'd like on news, politics, sport, business and more, head to telegraph.co.uk/liespodcast, where you can get 30 days free access to the Telegraph online. And if you haven't already, I'd really recommend listening to the first 2 series of Bed of Lies, in which Cara investigates 2 very different scandals. I might be biased, but I think they're definitely worth your time. Thanks again for listening.
I've broken 30 plus years of silence from our family. We didn't stay silent.
Paul Wilson is on video call from his home in Belfast. I'm in London. He's only recently decided to go public with his story.
In order to start shaking things up, we're going to have to break the silence.
Paul's 38, the youngest of 4 siblings. His dad, Thomas Emmanuel Wilson, was killed in 1987. And you were just a baby when your dad was killed?
I was 9 months old. So I have no recollections of my father whatsoever.
What's your mum told you about him?
He loved to read. He was one of those people that could read a book and watch TV at the same time and not lose the plot on either side of it. I don't know how that's possible, but apparently he could do it.
Known to everyone as Manuel, he had no connection to the IRA.
He was a member of the Workers' Party, so he believed more in socialism and the rights for the workers.
Manuel made a conscious effort to keep politics out of their home.
He had his strong beliefs, but he never wanted that passed on to his children.
In June 1987, when Manuel was just 35, he was abducted by the IRA's nutting squad and accused of being an informer.
He was obviously beaten while he was being held and interrogated, and then he was shot.
It was just after 11 this morning when residents heard shots coming from a laneway at the rear of Rodney Street off the Donegal Road. A number of people rushed to the scene and found the body of a man lying at the corner of the lane. His hands had been bound and his shoes removed. Later, the IRA said they carried out the killing. A man called a Belfast newspaper and claimed that the dead man, Emmanuel Wilson, was a police informer.
1987 changed my family's life absolutely completely. You know, my mum went from having a partner and a husband, raising 4 kids, to being on her own. And then the repercussions of the lies that was told by the provisional IRA over him being an informer. There was stigma attached to that.
There was no proper investigation into his murder.
I did have genuine anger towards the provisional IRA. I also had anger towards the police service, and there was never any case of they even tried to find out who murdered my father.
Then, in 2017, the family were contacted by detectives from Operation Kenova, who told them an agent had been involved in abducting and murdering Manuel.
Things started to make a bit more sense of why the police, there was never an investigation.
The agent was known as Stakeknife, and a gun linked to him had been used to shoot Manuel.
The gun was used in at least 5 murders, and what was called as a punishment shooting or a kneecapping. And the person that was kneecapped identified Freddie Scappaticci as the shooter, and it was the same gun that was used on my father.
The detectives had more details about Manuel's final hours. They believed he was likely abducted because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time.
He was only held for 14 hours maximum, one of the shortest times by internal security unit.
Kenova sent files to the prosecution service, and Paul was hopeful Scap would be prosecuted based on what the detectives told him.
The words they kept using was very good, strong case we believe we have set forward. And that was echoed every time they talked about the file sent to the PPS.
But 2 years passed, and nothing happened. Then, Freddie Scappaticci died, and Paul received a letter saying there would be no prosecution because the only suspect was deceased. And how did you feel when Freddie Scappaticci died?
Deflated. Absolutely deflated. And all we ever wanted was a prosecution. So when he died and I knew straight away that was never going to happen. It was like, what the hell were these 8 years for?
As Operation Kenova draws to an end, Paul can't believe John Boucher wasn't allowed to confirm that Scap was the agent Stakeknife. And Paul's recently found out he won't be able to see all the files Kenova have on his dad's case.
I was promised at the start of this that whatever they found, we would be shown.
But he's now been told those files will be redacted for national security reasons.
I want to see the whole truth. What this internal messages after my father was killed, where this information come that was sent to the PPS that proved that Freddie Scappaticci was the one that murdered my father.
Like many families before him, Paul decided he needed more help. So he went to lawyer Kevin Winters. What do you want to achieve now, ultimately?
I want to read everything that pertains to my dad's death. And if I get to see unredacted files relating to dad's case, you'd never hear from us again.
Paul has a new strategy to get what he wants.
I'm going to try and move forward and get a public inquiry. I believe I have a duty to my father to go as far as I can and say at the end of the day, I did my utmost, I did my best. There's nothing more I can do.
And do you think a public inquiry should focus on Stakeknife, or do you think there should be a wider public inquiry on agents across the board?
I think the public inquiry should be on MI5 and the state. MI5 have done nothing but hinder, obstruct, obscure, and now at the minute, delay.
In my work covering other scandals, I've learnt that inquiries can sometimes be the only way to bring closure and hold institutions to account after decades-long cover-ups. I've started to think maybe there needs to be a public inquiry into agents in the Troubles, agents for the FRU, Special Branch and MI5 who were involved in violence and murder. I've put this to a lot of people. Lawyer Kevin Winters believes there should be an inquiry into other agents who were in the IRA alongside Freddie Scappaticci. In the wake of Kenova's interim report, is there a feeling that there needs to be a wider inquiry?
I called that out. I said that at the press conference on Friday.
What do you think that wider inquiry should be focused on?
IRA Internal Security Unit, 1979 to 1994.
He says that inquiry should definitely cover Peter Keeley, the unsung hero who was involved in killing members of the security forces. Is there an argument to be made for a kind of full, sweeping look?
Of course there is. We're working on that on the loyalist side. The difficulty is that once you start looking at those wider thematic issues, and it starts getting very complicated.
Lord Stevens spent 17 years on his 3 police inquiries. He faced obstruction, threats, and his office full of evidence burning down in that suspicious fire. In the face of this, he still managed to expose the FRU's collusion with Brian Nelson and Freddie Scappaticci. He says,
I think there should have been a public inquiry years ago.
And do you think there would be value in a public inquiry now?
Gosh, I don't know. I mean, these public inquiries go on and on and on. I think if any public inquiry, it's got to be on a limited time, cost very little money, and be run by people who understand the need for clarity and what evidence is.
I find there's a lot of scepticism about what an inquiry could achieve and whether it would ever happen. Former Chief Constable Sir Hugh Ord doesn't think an inquiry could turn up much after so many years.
Unless people start opening their eyes and looking at the past in Northern Ireland in a different way, all we will get is people, he said, she said, I'm right, you're wrong, my truth versus your truth. There's something about having an ambiguous truth, which was exactly what the Eames-Bradley report was trying to achieve, to allow people to move on, to have their say, to have a smorgasbord of solutions, if you like.
But the government has just announced a public inquiry into this area. One of Prime Minister Keir Starmer's first acts in government was to open an inquiry into the murder of Pat Finucane, the murder which Hugh Orde and John Stevens had investigated in Stevens 3. Pat's widow Geraldine welcomed the news.
After 35 years of campaigning for such an inquiry, I believe this announcement represents a significant step forward for my family in our fight to uncover all of the circumstances behind Pat's murder. We have only ever been concerned with uncovering the truth. It is this that has kept us going. It is the thing that has been missing all these years.
Their son John is now an MP for Sinn Féin. He said,
The state targeted and set in motion events that meant my father was murdered in front of all of us as we had our dinner.
Pat's case is shocking, involving multiple agents, handlers from the police and army, briefings in Westminster, and multiple cover-ups. But there are many more cases like Pat's, which are less high profile.
I regret to say that not every family that deserves a public inquiry is going to get one.
Former human rights advocate Jane Winter has supported the Finucanes since the 90s. She adds,
So in a way the Pat Finucane inquiry is going to stand in for them, and they deserve answers to the wider questions that they have.
The previous Conservative government set up a new commission to investigate those individual cases back in 2023, the Independent Commission for Reconciliation and Information Recovery. It's a bit of a mouthful. It was created by the Legacy Act, which has been mired in controversy. Part of the motivation for the Legacy Act was to protect retired soldiers and police officers from prosecution. Former Veterans Minister Johnny Mercer said at the time,
We've had people from Plymouth dragged over to courts at 6:30 in the morning in Northern Ireland. You cannot look me in the eye as a veteran and say that is the right thing to do.
The Legacy Act gave immunity to suspects who gave evidence to the Commission and banned new criminal investigations and civil cases from the Troubles. For the first time in half a century, all sides in Northern Ireland were united against the Legacy Act.
Bring in this legacy bill that's totally against every victim, whether you're Protestant or Catholic. It's a total outrage.
I think it's purely to pursue a cover-up.
The state obviously is trying their best to close everything down, to shut down any threat of legal processes, continually exposing what the state's role was in the handling and oversight of agents on an industrial scale during the conflict. The courts are closed, go home, you're not allowed to use the courts. Just think about that. It is absolutely stunning.
No victims here have any input, yet they're pushing this ahead to stop victims getting any sort of justice whatsoever.
The legacy legislation is not an attempt by the British state to protect 80-year-old paratroopers. Nobody in Westminster gives a damn. This is specifically to protect the hierarchy of the provisional IRA.
This legislation is not about truth. It's not about justice, and it certainly is not about reconciliation. This is very much about placing an obstacle in the way of families who are fighting time and time again, decade after decade.
I know it's such a cliche, but the phrase, "you can't handle the truth," comes to mind.
The Labour government is repealing the most controversial parts of the Act, immunity and the ban on new cases. But the Commission is here to stay. I met with the head, Sir Declan Morgan, back in the summer of 2024. He came to the Telegraph's offices before their work really started.
OK, do you want me to say anything more?
Declan's the former Lord Chief Justice of Northern Ireland. He previously acted for the families of 13 unarmed people who were shot dead by British soldiers in the Bloody Sunday inquiry. He hoped that meant the public would trust him.
I thought, because I'd had a reasonably good reception, that the families would be pleased. In fact, they thought this was yet another scheme to actually do them out of finding the truth.
He's found it hard to shake off the negative connections with the Legacy Act.
And indeed, when I was asked to consider doing this, I had to think long and hard about whether I felt that I could achieve the sorts of aims I've been talking about to help discover the unvarnished truth for the people who deserve to know it.
Declan says he has the same powers as a public inquiry, but his commission can only investigate cases that families ask him to look into. That requires trust. Nearly a year into their work, the commission is investigating 96 killings. It's a small number compared to over 1,000 unsolved deaths of the Troubles. For Lord Stevens, the focus on individual cases means we miss the bigger picture.
I think it really is in the public interest for people to understand that there was both sides. This just wasn't the IRA nutting squad. We had Nelson. And just as importantly, in the middle of that is the Frew.
Which no one's ever heard of.
Which no one has ever heard of.
Not only could a public inquiry look at the whole picture and address every survivor and bereaved relative's questions, it could also make sure this never happens again.
It should be about the victims' relatives. Sort out what their wants are. You could do that in a simple way of what went wrong. And then most importantly are the recommendations to make sure it wouldn't happen again. Because at the end of the day, with all these things, are the lessons learned and how are you making the world a better place by those recommendations?
The Frew was disbanded, but the army still has an intelligence arm that runs spies. As former Frew handler Rob Lewis says,
the Frew no longer exists, and 14 In no longer exists. They're now both rolled into what is now called the SRR, the Special Reconnaissance Regiment. It's mainly focused, I think, in places like Yemen, Afghanistan. There's a limited role in Northern Ireland.
Special Branch and MI5 also run agents. There are new laws governing their work. Agents can now be officially authorised to commit crimes to maintain their cover. Whether or not there's a public inquiry, Lord Stevens insists on one thing. All the information that's currently held in secret should be released, including the reports from his 3 inquiries. 17 pages, a summary of your report is all that was made publicly available.
That's absolutely right. Well, there's hundreds and hundreds of other pages on the report, I can assure you of that. And then on top of it, you mustn't forget, are the reports we put into the Director of Public Prosecutions and the Attorney General. And there are hundreds and hundreds of pages of statements, documents, all that.
John's former colleague Vince McFadden completely agrees.
Release everything. As far as I'm concerned, all the reports for everything should be made public. It does mean there's going to be a cost and some heartache for people that otherwise have settled down now to a peaceful and prosperous life.
Vince says there was once an argument that disclosing these documents could endanger lives, but that's no longer the case.
These things have gone on far too long. Should it go for this length of time, and the relatives being subject to all this grief and anxiety?
Sir Declan Morgan wants to address these difficulties head on. After all, his commission's work includes recovery of missing information.
National security is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. I think the starting point has to be that everything that can be made public should be made public.
In my reporting, I found there are normally 4 things people want from a public inquiry: the truth, compensation, an official apology, and prosecutions. For Paul Wilson, whose father was killed by Stakeknife, only one of these matters.
Those files have been sitting there from 1987. Nothing that Kenova found on Dad's case was new. Hand the frickin' files over. Just hand them over. Doesn't cost anything. You have them, we want them, we deserve them. Give them over. It's been 37 years since my dad was murdered.
There are many questions that remain unanswered, which could be addressed in a public inquiry. First, how many other agents were there, like Brian Nelson and Freddie Scappaticci, who were prolific in their violence while spying for the state? I discussed this with reporter John Ware.
It's highly improbable that these were the only two bad apples. I recall a conversation with my former BBC colleague Barney Rowan, the BBC's Northern Ireland security correspondent, and he told me that he had run this bad apple point past a former head of Special Branch who responded that some of the agents that the branch had run would make Scappaticci look like a choir boy.
Second, why have there been so few prosecutions? Of all these hundreds of agents, only 4 have ever been prosecuted.
Brian Nelson, Freddie Scappaticci, Beano Casey, Mark Hegarty.
Why haven't there been any prosecutions from anyone from the intelligence services?
Go figure. I don't know the answer.
One theory is that justice functions differently in Northern Ireland to the rest of the UK. Neil Mackay, the reporter who exposed Stakeknife, says,
if this had happened in London, right, or Glasgow or Cardiff, we wouldn't be having this conversation because lots of people would be in prison and this would now be a well-established part of the history books.
Jane Winter explains more.
In the past, I think it was a system of injustice, and I think it was warped by the anti-terrorist legislation that was in place, which was draconian. I think Northern Ireland is different. You don't even have to discuss the need to protect state agencies. You can just say, this needs looking into, doesn't it? There's not a conspiracy that you can find written down on a piece of paper or anything. But people know. They know whose side they're on and they know what they're doing.
The third question an inquiry could answer is, what did the security forces achieve by infiltrating the Loyalist and Republican paramilitaries so extensively? Ray White from Special Branch is clear on this.
That's what kept people alive. And as I say, it'll continue to keep people alive if the security services do that.
His former colleague, the handler known as Trevor, adds,
in the whole 30 years I was in Special Branch, if we didn't have those people and that information, there would have been many, many, many more people killed.
Can you give me any sort of examples?
Yes, there was bombings, commercial bombings in Belfast city centre, in Londonderry and Armagh or anywhere else. I mean, there was lives saved. There's no two ways about that.
But we know many lives were still lost, both in spite of and because of agents. In some pockets, the paramilitaries were so heavily infiltrated, people have said the state was essentially controlling them. Former Frew handler Ian Hurst says,
I would respectfully suggest that that wouldn't be acceptable in, say, Tottenham, if you had 2 drug gangs, one in East London and one in North London. I think the Met would take exception to that, for them running agents which essentially took each other out.
Some people believe the widespread network of agents helped guide the paramilitaries towards peace. A Frew handler told Neil Mackay,
imagine that the IRA and the UVF are playing a game of chess, and British Army walks into the room, turns off all the lights, moves all the pieces towards endgame, turns the lights back on and says, there's your peace process.
But Ray White doesn't agree agents were involved in anything so strategic.
The only goal that we had was to take, as it were, as much action as we could against them that frustrated what they were doing.
And then there's the big question, the one I've been trying to answer in this series. Is the state getting away with murder? Ray is firmly on the side of no. In fact, he doesn't even believe there was widespread collusion.
We shouldn't be left, as it were, being labelled as being collusive.
Do you think there were any mistakes that were made that you would put on record?
There was mistakes, I'm sure. And I'm not saying that the police service or the military were entirely clean. When you have 30,000 odd people through the police service and 250,000 through the military, you're bound to have a bad apple or two, as it were, in the barrel.
The detectives who worked on the Stevens inquiry tell me their time in Northern Ireland has made them see our country in a totally different light. Phil James says he realised
the state were capable of doing terrible things.
Including murder?
Or you say that in Stevens 3.
Is the state getting away with murder?
It gives the impression that there's the Prime Minister is doing all this stuff. It's not. That's not how it works at all.
But there are cases.
Rogue units within the government, within the structures that the government put in place.
So Hugh Ord is in the studio with Phil James and I. He adds,
And the vast majority of people murdered during the Troubles were not murdered by the state. The vast number of people who died, who were murdered by terrorists in Northern Ireland on both sides. This ability to paint the whole of the RUC, the whole of the British Army as these bad guys is utterly wrong. You know, they kept people alive.
But Hugh does concede there were definitely times when the police, army and MI5 got it wrong.
The moment the state starts to behave like those it's trying to disrupt and arrest, you're in a very bad place.
Vince McFadden, who started on the Stevens inquiry right at the beginning in 1987, is initially reticent with me. Do you think the state is trying to get away with murder?
No comment. I think that's a huge statement to make, bearing in mind that there are still organisations that are operating in Northern Ireland that are a danger. There's the least said about that, I think the better.
Vince and I wrap up, leave his office and get into the car so he can drive me to the station. As we keep chatting, his approach softens. So are you glad that journalists are looking into this now?
Not really, to be honest. No, I think it could well generate another inquiry.
Why do you say that?
Well, because there are things there that could still be done.
What hasn't been investigated?
Well, a lot of the crimes.
If you were going to do another inquiry now, what would it be into?
Don't come here. Don't do it.
Well, that sounds suspicious to me. That sounds like it should be done. The state hasn't really had any repercussions.
No. There's no doubt Maggie Thatcher knew about this, and so did the committee used to sit on Northern Ireland matters.
What did Maggie Thatcher know about?
Well, they used to report back to her because she instigated the setting up of the MI5 Director General of Northern Ireland.
So we're talking about, handlers being involved in conspiracy to murder and informers who are being paid by the state while committing these atrocities. And you say Margaret Thatcher, it goes all the way up to her. So how could you not argue that the state is trying to get away with murder?
Well, yeah, it'd be a difficult one to defend. I wouldn't want to defend him.
Every police officer I've spoken to who's been involved in this world, either running agents for Special Branch or investigating them after the fact, has been deeply affected by the work. Former handler Trevor has PTSD.
It's dangerous. The areas you're going into, the people you're dealing with, the situations you're faced with, you never sleep well in Special Branch, to be honest with you.
How many hours?
Maybe 3 or 4, depending on how many Jamesons I put down my neck when I'm going to bed.
To this day, is it still like that?
Yes, you've got your memories. Many's the night I have conversations in bed down there with people who are a long time dead. It was as if they're sitting beside me having a conversation. I'm not looking for a sympathy vote here. I'm just saying to you, that's the way it is. You do it for long enough, it'll stick.
Those I've spoken to from the FRU, the Army's maverick agent handling unit, are more blasé, like Rob Lewis.
I'm quite proud to have served in the FRU, because I think, that me and my fellow members did a bloody good job. I'm just glad that I personally am completely and utterly clear of being alleged to have done, wrongdoings during those days. I'm 65 years of age now. I just like to go for a quiet pint. But I'm still flagged on the police computer. Could be armed. Very dangerous. I've had a bit of a life, I have to say. I wouldn't change a thing.
His old colleague Ian Hurst blew the whistle on the FRU and Freddie Scappaticci. Despite all that, Ian says the things he learnt in the army set him up for a very comfortable life.
Not a black and white situation, Cara.
Operates in the grey.
Yeah, it's a really, really difficult, exciting. I was privileged to have done my job.
What's the impact been like on you? Because I know that...
Fantastic. Those skill sets have led me through life. I'm a millionaire. And I came from the councillors. So yeah, those skill sets have served me well, Cara.
I began this series with 3 people who were shot dead by the UDA. Those cases have spooled out over nearly 40 years, revealing a web of collusion, criminality, and a state cover-up. Pat Finucane's family finally have a public inquiry. Lachlan McGinn's family are in a better place. They settled a civil case against the police and Ministry of Defence in 2022. But Michael Power's family are still waiting for justice. Their civil case with Kevin Winters is going through closed court hearings, and they're yet to have a sense of when it will reach open court. Michael's children, Michelle and Gavin, were injured in the shooting when masked gunmen shot Michael through the windscreen as he drove his family to church. Over time, it's the emotional scars that have become more pronounced. Gavin was just 5 when he lost his dad, and he remained in a state of terror for years, convinced the gunman would come back and kill him.
I tried to make makeshift weapons as a child in case they came to try and kill me. Quite sad now looking back, but I used to play with the idea that I could die and God could take me away and I would be fine. I would be with my father, I'd be in heaven. So I would look for ways in which I could maybe fool God into thinking that I was dead. So I would fall down and pretend to have a heart attack and lie down very still and wait for God to come and collect me.
As Gavin grew, these fears have shaped him.
I developed certain oddities with myself, and I didn't understand the way that I was, and then later it was discovered that it was OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and it's all around control and also PTSD.
A couple of years after the shooting, his sister Michelle started having panic attacks.
I was sitting in class and all of a sudden I could hear every noise amplified. So I could hear every single pencil that was writing on the paper. I could hear the tick of the clock. I could hear if somebody, put their hair behind their ear. I could hear all the individual sounds in the room. And then eventually it moved into a rhythm. The sound moved into a rhythm. And dun, 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 all the sounds. And then they became so loud. And then it's just silent. And the ringing, similar ringing actually to the day of the attack, of the sound, the similar, just like a dee, and I could just hear that, and then it all kind of stopped.
Michelle has been haunted by glass ever since the windscreen shattered over her, lining the bottom of the bath with shards for weeks and scoring her eyes like a football pitch.
At a house party or in a bar or a restaurant, anybody smashing a glass would have taken me straight back to that day, like I'm just sat there.
Their younger sister, Emma, was only a baby when their dad was killed, so she only knows him by the photos, his long blonde hair and loving smile as he holds his wife Bernadette around the waist. As for Bernadette herself,
she was very, very broken. When she was dropping us off to school, I used to have to tell her to wipe under her eyes because she always wore a lot of mascara and obviously had cried herself to sleep.
I still have to look at my mother and think she has to eat her meals by herself. She goes to bed alone every night. When she has worries, she has no one to talk to about it. All that was taken away, by those brutal psychopaths.
She was only young, she was only 30, with 3 small children, and here we are.
When I ask them what they want, it's not revenge or prosecutions, even though the gunmen are still out there, never charged for Michael's murder.
I've prayed for the men, and I still do pray for the men that carried it out. I understand it was a conflict.
I genuinely hold no hatred in my heart for the men that pulled that trigger. And it isn't about, trying to get anyone imprisoned or anything like that. Our fight is against the state. The state need to be held to account.
Brian Nelson abducted and tortured his first victim, Gerald Higgins, more than half a century ago. And yet his children, Elaine and Gary, are also still fighting.
What would it mean for you, Gary, to have the truth?
Just that word closure, yeah. Just so we know what actually happened to my daddy, why it happened. People have been set up, been killed, murdered, assassinated, call it what you will. I think that needs to be exposed.
The people in power, the people that had the power to deal with this, I think they failed on a major scale.
I'll probably not be able to go to sleep again tonight.
It really has had a profound effect on Gary's life. But I think it was good for him today to be able to kind of just say that. And I think that's cathartic for him. I suppose there's a sort of healing process too, to being able to define what exactly it is that you want out of this. And as we both are very clear, I think the ultimate aim is to uncover the harsh, dirty truth of what actually happened, so we can just put it to rest.
I'm Cara McGugan, and this was Bed of Lies from The Telegraph. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please do leave a 5-star rating and a short review. It'll help new listeners find us. If you have a story that needs investigating, get in touch. cara.mcgugan@telegraph.co.uk, and I'm on social media @CJMcGugan. Bed of Lies was written by me and produced by Sarah Peters at Tuning Fork Productions. The executive producers were Louisa Wells, Adelie Pojman-Ponte and Venetia Rainey. Sound design was by Rich Evans, Peregrine Andrews and Mike Woolley, with additional reporting and research by John Ware and Mick Brown. I'd also like to thank Rachel Welsh, Georgia Cohn, Ryan Gudge, Louis Brady and Theodora Laludis for their help with this series. For more of my in-depth reporting, my book, The Poison Line, Life and Death in the Infected Blood Scandal, is out now with Penguin. If you haven't already done so, listen to the award-winning first 2 series of Bed of Lies on this feed, in which I investigate 2 very different scandals. Please do consider taking out a Telegraph subscription. We couldn't have made this podcast without our subscribers. Sign up for 30 days free at telegraph.co.uk/Lies podcast.